Lieutenant Audrey Walsh had seen some questionable life choices during her 15-year stint with the Galactic Coalition, but none quite as spectacularly stupid as what she was contemplating right now. She crouched in the dim maintenance tunnel beneath mining station Vexahara, her headlamp illuminating a sight that should have sent her running in the opposite direction, preferably while screaming and firing her plasma rifle. Instead, she found herself making soft clicking sounds at what was unmistakably a Nexarian predator cub. Now, for those keeping score at home, Nexarians were the kind of species that made grown admirals wet themselves and entire star systems evacuate when even a single adult was spotted on long-range sensors. These weren't your garden-variety dangerous aliens. Oh no, that would be too simple. Nexarians were apex predators that could punch through battleship armor with their bare claws, survive in the vacuum of space for extended periods, and had a delightful habit of considering most other species as convenient snack foods. And here was Audrey, a perfectly rational human engineer, going psst, 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 at what would eventually grow up to be a living nightmare with anger management issues. The cub couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, barely the size of a house cat, though its crystalline spines already gleamed with an ominous metallic sheen. Its amber eyes, the same shade that haunted the dreams of Coalition Marines, tracked her movements with an intelligence that was frankly unsettling in something so small. Dark blue-black fur covered its compact body, and despite its diminutive size, Audrey could already see the powerful muscle definition that would one day make it a galactic terror. Right now, though, it looked about as threatening as a slightly grumpy kitten. A slightly grumpy kitten that could probably bite through her fingers. But still. "Well, aren't you just precious?" Audrey muttered, her voice dripping with the kind of sarcasm that had earned her 3 disciplinary hearings and a reputation as the station's resident smartmouth. "Let me guess. Mommy and Daddy got themselves blown up by some trigger-happy patrol, and now you're stuck playing hide-and-seek in my ventilation system." The cub's ears flicked forward at the sound of her voice, and it took a tentative step closer. Audrey noticed the slight limp in its left hind leg and the way its ribs showed through its fur. Whatever had happened to its family, this little guy had been on his own for a while. "Oh, for crying out loud!" she groaned, recognizing the look of desperate hunger in those predator eyes. "You're starving, aren't you?" Station Vexahara wasn't exactly the armpit of the galaxy, but it was close enough to smell it on a good day. Perched on the edge of Coalition space, it processed rare minerals that made faster-than-light travel possible, the kind of unglamorous but essential work that kept civilization running. The station housed about 300 beings from a dozen different species, all united by their shared desire to make enough credits to retire somewhere with better atmospheric processors. Audrey had been assigned here after what her commanding officer diplomatically called personality conflicts with her previous crew. Apparently, telling a hegemony general that his battle strategy had all the tactical brilliance of a concussed space whale was considered insubordination. Who knew? The truth was, Audrey preferred the frontier stations. Out here, competence mattered more than politics, and humans, despite being relative newcomers to the galactic community, had earned a reputation for being reliable, if somewhat unpredictable. They weren't the strongest, fastest, or smartest species in the Coalition, but they had something that consistently surprised their alien colleagues. They gave a damn about things that weren't necessarily their problem. Case in point, the tiny apex predator currently trying to decide if she was food or friend. "All right, little guy," Audrey said, slowly reaching into her toolkit. She pulled out a protein bar, standard Coalition rations that supposedly tasted like chicken but had the texture of recycled cardboard. Let's see if you're desperate enough to try human food." She broke off a small piece and tossed it toward the cub. It landed about a foot away, and the little Nexarian approached with the kind of careful stalking behavior that would be adorable if it weren't being performed by something genetically engineered to kill efficiently. The cub sniffed the protein bar, looked up at Audrey with what could only be described as deeply offended dignity, then ate it anyway. Apparently, even baby apex predators had standards, but hunger was hunger. "Yeah, I know," Audrey chuckled. "Coalition food is an insult to taste buds galaxy-wide. But it's got protein and minerals, which I'm guessing you need more than flavor right now." As she watched the cub devour the rest of the protein bar with desperate efficiency, Audrey's comm unit crackled to life. "Walsh, report to command. We've got irregularities in the ventilation system readings." Audrey winced. Station Commander Vulneth was an Aqualan, one of those annoyingly thorough aquatic species that noticed everything and forgot nothing. If the station's sensors were picking up anomalies in the maintenance tunnels, it wouldn't be long before someone came looking for the source. "On my way, Commander," she replied, then looked back at the cub. "Well, this complicates things. The smart thing to do would be to report the cub immediately." Protocol was clear. Any Nexarian presence, regardless of age or circumstances, was to be reported to Coalition Command for immediate disposal. The official term was neutralization, but everyone knew what it meant. The problem was, Audrey had never been particularly good at doing the smart thing. "You know what?" she said to the cub, who was now grooming himself with a tiny pink tongue. "I've made worse decisions, usually involving alcohol and karaoke, but still." She pulled out her emergency beacon disruptor, a handy little device that every engineer carried for working in areas where they didn't want to accidentally trigger security alerts. In theory, it was for maintaining sensitive equipment without setting off false alarms. In practice, it was perfect for creating temporary blind spots in the station's monitoring system. "Here's the deal, buddy," Audrey said, activating the disruptor. "I'm going to go deal with my boss, who's probably wondering why his fancy sensors are acting up. You're going to stay right here and try not to eat anything important. Think you can handle that?" The cub tilted his head, those amber eyes studying her with unsettling intelligence. Then he did something that made Audrey's heart skip a beat. He chirped. Not a growl or a snarl, but a soft, almost musical sound that was clearly meant to be communicative. "Well, I'll be damned," she whispered. "You're actually trying to talk to me, aren't you?" Most species in the galaxy had some form of communication, but Nexarians were notorious for their silence. Adult Nexarians didn't vocalize. They communicated through pheromones and body language when they bothered to communicate at all. The fact that this cub was making sounds meant, well, Audrey wasn't sure what it meant, but it felt significant. "All right, I'm officially naming you Bolt," she decided, "because something tells me you're going to be fast, and because, hey you, apex predator baby, is a mouthful." Bolt chirped again, then did something that nearly gave Audrey a heart attack. He approached her extended hand and bumped it with his tiny head. The gesture was so trusting, so completely at odds with everything the galaxy knew about Nexarians, that Audrey felt her tough-as-nails facade crack just a little. "Oh, you little manipulator," she muttered, gently scratching behind his ears. His fur was surprisingly soft, and she could feel the vibration of what might have been purring. "Fine, but this is temporary, you understand? Just until we figure out what to do with you." Even as she said it, Audrey knew she was lying to herself. Something about this tiny creature had already wormed its way past her defenses. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, not with the cold calculation she expected from a predator, but with something that looked suspiciously like hope. Her comm crackled again. "Walsh, where are you? I'm reading power fluctuations in your sector." "2 minutes out, Commander," she replied, then looked at Bolt. "I'll be back with food. Real food, if I can figure out what baby Nexarians eat. Try not to get us both court-martialed while I'm gone." As she made her way through the maintenance tunnels toward command, Audrey's mind was already racing with the logistics of what she was contemplating. Hiding a Nexarian cub on a Coalition station wasn't just against regulations. It was borderline insane. But then again, she'd never been accused of being overly sane. The galaxy whispered that humans were unpredictable, stubborn, and had a dangerous tendency to adopt things that could kill them. As Audrey climbed out of the maintenance hatch and headed toward what was undoubtedly going to be a very interesting conversation with her commanding officer, she couldn't help but smile. Sometimes, the galaxy got humans exactly right. 3 weeks into what Audrey had mentally dubbed Operation "Don't Get Everyone Killed by My Adorable Murder Baby," she was beginning to understand why the galaxy considered humans certifiably insane. Bolt had grown. Not dramatically, he was still small enough to hide in her quarters, but the change was noticeable to anyone who knew what to look for. His crystalline spines had developed a sharper edge, his amber eyes held more focus, and his playful pounces on her spare boots now left actual claw marks in the synthetic leather. More concerning was his appetite. "You can't possibly still be hungry," Audrey muttered, watching Bolt demolish his third protein bar of the morning. "At this rate, you're going to eat through my monthly ration allowance in a week." Bolt looked up from his breakfast, made that musical chirping sound he used when he wanted something, then nudged his empty food bowl with his nose. The bowl, which Audrey had fashioned from spare metal sheeting, now bore distinct tooth marks around the rim. "Right, because I'm running a 5-star restaurant here," she said, but reached for another protein bar anyway. "You know, back on Earth, people pay good money for pets that don't require industrial-grade portions." The truth was, Audrey had been doing research. The Coalition databases were frustratingly sparse when it came to Nexarian biology. Most of the entries focused on how to kill them, rather than how to care for their young, but she'd managed to piece together some useful information. Nexarian cubs had accelerated growth rates and required specific minerals that were naturally found in their homeworld's prey species. Unfortunately, their homeworld had been sterilized by the hegemony 23 years ago, which explained why finding an orphaned cub was about as likely as winning the galactic lottery. It also explained why Bolt was probably the last of his kind. That thought had been keeping Audrey awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her cramped quarters while Bolt curled up against her side, purring in his sleep. The galaxy's most feared apex predators reduced to a single cub who trusted a human engineer enough to sleep with his belly exposed. "All right, buddy," she said, breaking up another protein bar. "I managed to requisition some mineral supplements from the medical bay. Doc Haval thinks I'm developing a calcium deficiency." She paused. "Which, technically, I am, since you're eating most of my food." Bolt's ears perked up at the mention of supplements. Over the past few weeks, Audrey had noticed his reactions to different foods and discovered that he seemed to have an instinct for what his body needed. When she'd managed to swipe some iron tablets from the supply closet, he'd nearly vibrated with excitement. The bigger problem wasn't feeding him, it was keeping him hidden. Bolt was curious, intelligent, and had the typical predator's tendency to explore his territory, which, from his perspective, included the entire station. Yesterday, she'd found him in her tool locker, somehow having figured out how to open the magnetic lock. The day before, he'd managed to wedge himself into the ventilation shaft above her workstation, apparently fascinated by the electrical conduits that ran through the walls. His favorite game seemed to be seeing how many different hiding spots he could find in her quarters, a talent that would have been impressive if it weren't giving Audrey premature gray hair. "You're going to get us both spaced if someone catches you," she warned, watching Bolt investigate a loose panel in the wall. "And by spaced, I mean they'll probably study you first, then space us both." The truth was, their secret was becoming harder to maintain. Station Commander Vulneth had been asking pointed questions about the power fluctuations in her sector, and Security Chief Calvier, a hegemony enforcer with all the warmth and charm of a black hole, had started making random inspections of the maintenance areas. Calvier was particularly problematic. The hegemony species had lost 3 colonies to Nexarian attacks in the past 50 years, and their military doctrine basically boiled down to shoot first, ask questions never when it came to apex predators. If he found Bolt, there wouldn't be a trial or a hearing, just a very brief and violent ending to their unusual partnership. Audrey's comm unit buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at the display and felt her stomach drop. "Walsh, report to Bay 94 for equipment inspection. Bring full diagnostic gear." "Calvier." "Well, that's not ominous at all," she muttered, then looked at Bolt, who was now hanging upside down from her ceiling fixture, apparently testing whether the gravity plating worked from multiple angles. "Bolt, down, now." The cub dropped gracefully to the floor and padded over to her, sensing her tension. One thing Audrey had learned about Nexarians: they were incredibly empathic. Bolt seemed to read her moods with uncanny accuracy, and right now his amber eyes were sharp with alertness. "I have to go deal with our friendly neighborhood enforcer," she explained, grabbing her toolkit. "You need to stay here and be absolutely, completely quiet. No chirping, no exploring, no doing whatever that thing was where you somehow got into the air recycling unit." Bolt tilted his head, then made a sound that was distinctly different from his usual chirps. Lower, more questioning. It took Audrey a moment to realize he was trying to mimic human speech patterns. "Did you just try to say, 'okay'?" she asked, staring at him, because that sounded remarkably like. "Okay," Bolt repeated, the syllables rough but unmistakable. Audrey sat down heavily on her bunk. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me. You're learning to talk." "Of course you are, because my life wasn't complicated enough already." The implications were staggering. Adult Nexarians were non-vocal, but if cubs could learn language, it changed everything the galaxy thought it knew about the species. It suggested a level of adaptability and intelligence that had never been documented. It also made Bolt infinitely more valuable and more dangerous. "Listen to me very carefully," Audrey said, crouching down to meet Bolt's eyes. "When I'm not here, you don't make sounds. No chirping, no trying to talk, nothing. Can you understand that?" "Understand," Bolt repeated slowly, then made his affirmative chirp. "Good. And if someone comes in, anyone who isn't me, you hide. Deep hide, like we practiced. Remember?" Bolt's response was to vanish. One moment he was sitting in front of her, the next he'd melted into the shadows behind her storage locker with the fluid grace that would make him a legendary predator someday. Even knowing where he'd gone, Audrey could barely see him. "Perfect," she whispered. "Stay hidden until I get back." Bay 94 was in the station's outer ring, where the mining equipment was serviced and repaired. It was also, Audrey noticed, conveniently far from the main populated areas. The kind of place where screaming wouldn't be heard, and bodies could be easily disposed of. She found Calvier waiting for her, his forearms crossed over his chitinous chest in the universal gesture of, "Someone's about to have a very bad day." The hegemony enforcer stood nearly 8 feet tall, with compound eyes that missed nothing and mandibles that could bite through steel plating. His species had evolved from hive-mind insects, and while they developed individual consciousness eons ago, they still retained the collective's ruthless efficiency. "Walsh," he clicked, his translator rendering the sounds into flat, emotionless syllables. "You will explain the energy anomalies in Sector 9. "Energy anomalies?" Audrey replied, setting down her toolkit with deliberate casualness. "I ran diagnostics on all the systems in my sector yesterday. Everything's operating within normal parameters. Normal parameters do not include power drains consistent with life support for unauthorized biological entities," Colville stated, his compound eyes reflecting the bay's harsh lighting. "Nor do they include the thermal signatures I have been tracking." Audrey's blood turned to ice water, but her expression remained neutral. 20 years of military service had taught her how to lie convincingly to superior officers, a skill that was apparently more transferable than she'd expected. "Thermal signatures could be equipment malfunctions," she said. "The heating units in the outer sections have been acting up since the last solar storm. I've been running diagnostics that might account for the power fluctuations." "Show me," Colville ordered. For the next hour, Audrey led the security chief through a masterclass in creative engineering explanations. Every anomaly he'd detected had a plausible technical cause. Every power fluctuation could be attributed to routine maintenance. Every thermal reading was consistent with equipment that was running just slightly off specification. It helped that most of what she was saying was actually true. She had been running extra diagnostics, the heating units were temperamental, and the station's aging infrastructure provided plenty of cover for unusual energy patterns. What she didn't mention was that half of those power fluctuations were caused by her jury-rigging additional food heating and air filtration for a growing Nexarian cub. "Your explanations are adequate," Colville finally admitted, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "However, I will be conducting regular inspections of your sector. Any further anomalies will result in a full security sweep." "Of course," Audrey replied. "I appreciate your thoroughness. Can't be too careful on a frontier station." As Colville stalked away, his movements precise and predatory, Audrey realized she was shaking. The security chief suspected something, and it was only a matter of time before his suspicions focused on the right target. She needed help, and there was only one person on the station who might be crazy enough to provide it. 20 minutes later, Audrey stood outside the quarters of Wren, the station's xenoarchaeologist. Wren was human, which was promising, and had a reputation for being almost as insubordinate as Audrey, which was even better. More importantly, she was one of the galaxy's leading experts on extinct predator species. "Wren," Audrey said when the door opened, "I need to ask you a hypothetical question about Nexarian cubs." Wren raised an eyebrow. She was a small woman with prematurely gray hair, and the kind of intense eyes that suggested she'd seen things that would give most people nightmares. "Hypothetical, huh? Does this hypothetical question have anything to do with the fact that you've been requisitioning enough food to feed a small army?" "Maybe. And would it explain why my mineral analysis equipment has been showing trace signatures of compounds that shouldn't exist anywhere in this star system?" Audrey's heart sank. "Possibly." Wren was quiet for a long moment, studying Audrey's face. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she was about to do something that would either save them all or get them spectacularly killed. "Well," she said, stepping aside to let Audrey into her quarters, "I've always wanted to meet a living Nexarian. Hypothetically speaking, of course." Wren's reaction to meeting Bolt was not what Audrey had expected. "Oh, you magnificent little nightmare," the xenoarchaeologist breathed, crouching down as Bolt cautiously approached her. "Look at those spine formations. Absolutely pristine development. And those eyes. The cognitive depth is remarkable." Bolt, now roughly the size of a medium dog but with the fluid musculature of something built for killing, tilted his head and made his questioning chirp. Wren's eyes widened. "He's vocalizing?" "Audrey, do you have any idea how extraordinary this is? Adult Nexarians haven't been documented making sounds since, well, since ever. But cubs might retain the ability if they're properly socialized." "Properly socialized," Audrey repeated dryly. "Right, because that's definitely what I've been doing, running a finishing school for apex predators." "Hello, beautiful," Wren said to Bolt, extending her hand slowly. "Aren't you just the most dangerous thing in the galaxy?" To Audrey's amazement, Bolt approached Wren without hesitation and bumped his head against her palm. The xenoarchaeologist's expression shifted from professional interest to something approaching wonder. "He's bonded to you," Wren said quietly. "Not just attached, actually bonded. The pheromone signatures, the body language, the way he keeps checking to make sure you're still there. Audrey, I think you've accidentally recreated something that hasn't existed for thousands of years." "What do you mean?" Wren stood up, her mind clearly racing. "There are fragments, ancient texts, archaeological evidence from dead worlds that suggest Nexarians weren't always solitary apex predators. The earliest records hint at some kind of symbiotic relationship with another species. A partnership that made both sides more than they were alone." "Partnership?" Audrey watched Bolt settle himself between the two women, his amber eyes alert, but relaxed. "You mean, like, pets?" "Not pets. Partners. The texts call them Star Walkers, beings who could traverse the void together, each providing what the other lacked. The Nexarians provided strength, protection, and survival instincts. Their partners provided intelligence, planning, and something the texts translate as heart sight." Audrey felt a chill run down her spine. "And you think—" "I think humans might be the descendants of those partners," Wren said. "It would explain why we're the only species that consistently forms emotional bonds with other races, why we keep trying to adopt things that could kill us, and why—" She gestured at Bolt, who was now playing with Audrey's bootlaces with deadly claws. "Why this little guy trusts you absolutely." Before Audrey could respond, the station's emergency klaxons began wailing. Red lights flashed throughout the corridor, and Commander Volneth's voice echoed over the communication system. "All personnel to emergency stations. We have detected a massive solar flare heading directly for our position. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Audrey and Wren exchanged glances. Solar flares in this system were rare but catastrophic. They could overload the station's shielding and fry every electronic system on board. "How long do we have?" Wren asked, checking her personal scanner. "Based on the intensity readings," Audrey did quick calculations, "maybe 2 hours before it hits us, but the electromagnetic precursor effects will start much sooner." As if summoned by her words, the lights flickered, and several non-essential systems began shutting down automatically. Emergency power kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. "I have to get to engineering," Audrey said. "The radiation shielding needs to be manually calibrated, or we're all going to be very attractive, glowing corpses." "Wait," Wren grabbed her arm. "Take Bolt with you." Are you insane? Engineering will be crawling with people trying to— Nexarians have natural resistance to radiation, Wren interrupted. Their crystalline spine structure actually absorbs and redirects electromagnetic energy. If the shielding fails, he might be the only one who can survive in the core areas long enough to make repairs. Audrey looked down at Bolt, who was watching their conversation with obvious intelligence. The cub seemed to sense the urgency in the air. His ears were forward, his body coiled and ready for action. You want me to bring my secretly adopted apex predator cub into the most sensitive area of the station, during a crisis, when every senior officer will be there watching. I want you to bring the only being on this station who might be able to save all our lives, Wren said firmly. Another power fluctuation rocked the station, and this time the artificial gravity flickered. Bolt immediately crouched low, instinctively adapting to the changing conditions. Bolt, Audrey said, making her decision. We're going to go help keep everyone alive. Think you can handle that? Handle, Bolt repeated, his pronunciation clearer than before. Then he did something that made both women stare. He stood on his hind legs and placed his front paws on Audrey's chest in what was unmistakably a hug. Oh, we are so dead, Audrey muttered, but she was smiling. The engineering section was chaos. Technicians from half a dozen species rushed between control stations, trying to manually adjust systems as the station's computers struggled with the increasing electromagnetic interference. Commander Volneth stood at the central command post, his aquatic features tense with concentration. "Walsh!" he called as Audrey entered. "Thank the depths you're here. The primary shielding array is fluctuating, and we can't get a stable." He stopped mid-sentence, his large eyes focusing on Bolt, who was following calmly at Audrey's heels. The entire engineering section went silent. 23 beings from various species, all staring at the Nexarian cub, who was sitting politely next to the human engineer, like the galaxy's most dangerous therapy animal. "Commander," Audrey said, her voice steady despite the fact that her heart was trying to beat its way out of her chest. "I can explain." "Explain what?" Security Chief Colvier's voice cut through the silence like a plasma cutter. He emerged from behind a control console, all four arms reaching for his weapons. "Explain why you have brought a Nexarian predator into the heart of this station." "I brought him because he's going to help us survive the next few hours," Audrey replied, stepping slightly in front of Bolt. "And because killing him right now would be the stupidest possible waste of resources." Colvier's mandibles clicked with aggression. "Nexarians killed millions." "Adult Nexarians killed millions," Audrey interrupted. "This is a cub who's been living peacefully on this station for weeks without hurting anyone. And right now, he's our best chance of surviving this solar flare." "She's right," Wren said, entering behind them with her scanner displaying radiation readings. "Nexarian biology makes them naturally resistant to the kind of electromagnetic bombardment we're about to face. If our shielding fails—" Another massive power surge swept through the station, and this time several control panels sparked and went dark. The artificial gravity failed completely for nearly 10 seconds, and emergency lighting began flickering erratically. "Radiation levels are spiking faster than projected," one of the technicians reported. "We've got maybe 30 minutes before the core areas become lethal to most species." Commander Volneth looked from Audrey to Bolt to his failing control systems. His expression was unreadable, but Audrey could see the calculations running behind his eyes. The probability of survival with their current resources versus the risk of trusting a human engineer and her impossible pet. "The central radiation core needs manual adjustment," he said finally. "But the electromagnetic field will kill anyone who gets within 50 meters of it, once the flare hits full intensity. Audrey knelt down next to Bolt. "I need you to understand something," she said quietly. "This is going to be dangerous. Really dangerous. If you help us, you might get hurt. But if we don't fix this, everyone on the station dies, including me." Bolt looked up at her with those startling amber eyes, then made a sound she'd never heard before. A low, thrumming note that seemed to resonate through the metal decking. It was unmistakably a sound of determination. "Together," he said clearly, the word perfectly pronounced. Several of the technicians gasped. Colvier's weapons remained drawn, but his stance had shifted from aggressive to confused. "He talks," Commander Volneth said wonderingly. "A Nexarian cub that talks." "He does more than that," Audrey said, standing up. "Bolt, can you sense the electromagnetic fields?" The cub's ears swiveled, and he turned toward the station's core with laser focus. His crystalline spines began to glow with a faint blue light, and he made a series of rapid clicks and chirps that sounded almost like echolocation. "Strong. Bad," he said, pointing toward the core with one claw. "Hurt. People." "That's right," Audrey said. "Can you help fix it?" Bolt's response was to pad over to the main engineering console and rear up on his hind legs, studying the radiation readings with obvious comprehension. Then he looked back at Audrey and nodded, an unmistakably human gesture that he'd clearly learned from her. The next few minutes were the most surreal of Audrey's career. Working together, she and Bolt made their way through the increasingly dangerous radiation zones toward the station's core. Where Audrey's instruments failed due to electromagnetic interference, Bolt's natural senses guided them. Where the radiation levels spiked beyond human tolerance, Bolt's crystalline spines absorbed the excess energy, creating a protective field around them both. They moved through areas that should have killed Audrey in seconds, the cub somehow using his developing abilities to shield her from the worst of the electromagnetic storm. And when they reached the core's manual override controls, it was Bolt who used his claws to manipulate the heavy switches that had been designed for armored maintenance drones. "Left! Turn the primary coupling left!" Audrey shouted over the howling electromagnetic interference, reading her scanner from the safety of a lead-lined alcove. Bolt, standing directly in a radiation field that should have cooked him instantly, carefully adjusted the controls with surgical precision. His spines were blazing with absorbed energy now, casting rainbow patterns across the metal walls. Now, the secondary array. No, the other direction. Working in perfect synchronization, the human engineer and the Nexarian cub performed repairs that neither could have accomplished alone. Audrey provided the technical knowledge and planning, while Bolt provided the strength and radiation resistance needed to actually implement the solutions. As the last connection was made and the station's shield stabilized, Bolt padded back to Audrey's alcove. He was glowing like a living constellation, excess energy crackling between his spines, but his amber eyes were bright and alert. "Good?" he asked, clearly exhausted but pleased with their work. "More than good," Audrey said, checking her scanner. "Perfect. You did perfectly." The trip back to engineering was triumphant. Every system they passed showed green readings, and the reports coming over the communication channels confirmed that the station would survive the solar flare with minimal damage. But as they entered the main engineering section, Audrey realized their real test was just beginning. The entire senior staff was waiting for them: Commander Volneth, Security Chief Colvier, and a dozen other officials who would now have to decide what to do about the human engineer and her impossible partnership with a Nexarian cub. Bolt seemed to sense the tension. He moved closer to Audrey, not hiding, but clearly presenting a united front. His spines still glowed with residual energy, making him look like something out of legend, beautiful and dangerous and utterly alien. "Well," Commander Volneth said finally, his voice thoughtful, "that was educational." The galaxy, as it turned out, had opinions about humans who saved space stations with the help of talking Nexarian cubs. Strong opinions. Very loud opinions. And most of them involved the phrase immediate termination, followed by increasingly creative suggestions about what to do with Audrey's remains. The Coalition Council has received 43 formal protests in the past week, Commander Volneth reported, his aquatic features betraying nothing as he read from his datapad. The Hegemony Enforcement Division wants you court-martialed. The Rigelian Commerce Guild suggests spacing you as a public safety measure. And the Altarian Peace Corps, who, I should note, have peace literally in their name, have requested permission to use you for target practice. Audrey sat in the station's conference room, Bolt curled up at her feet like the galaxy's most dangerous lapdog. 3 weeks had passed since their heroic repair mission, and the fallout had been substantial. "What about the good news?" she asked. "Please tell me there's good news." "The good news," Wren interjected from across the table, "is that every major xenobiology institute in the galaxy wants to study Bolt. The bad news is that most of them want to study him in very small, very dead pieces." Bolt's ears flicked at the mention of his name, and he made a soft, questioning sound. His growth had accelerated dramatically after the radiation exposure. He was now roughly the size of a large dog, his crystalline spines fully developed and gleaming with an inner light that spoke of absorbed energy. More remarkably, his vocabulary had expanded to include over 200 words, and his comprehension seemed to grow daily. "Not small pieces," he said firmly, having learned enough about galactic politics to understand the implications. "Stay together." "That's the plan, buddy," Audrey assured him, scratching behind his ears. The gesture that had once been risky was now routine. Bolt's trust in her was absolute, and his control over his predatory instincts was remarkable. Commander Volneth cleared his throat. "There is other news. The Coalition Command has decided to convene a formal hearing. You'll be transported to Capital Station in 3 days to present your case before the full council." "A hearing?" Audrey's stomach dropped. "What kind of hearing?" "The kind where they decide whether you're a pioneering xenobiologist who's made the discovery of the century," Wren said grimly, "or a dangerous lunatic who's endangering the galaxy by keeping a pet that could grow up to eat star systems." Security Chief Qualvier, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the solar flare incident, finally spoke. "There is precedent," he said reluctantly. "Ancient hegemony records speak of partnerships between our ancestors and other species. Alliances that made both sides stronger." This was news to everyone in the room. Qualvier had spent weeks trying to have Bolt destroyed, and now he was citing historical precedent for interspecies cooperation. "What changed your mind?" Audrey asked. The Enforcer's compound eyes fixed on Bolt, who was now sitting up and paying attention to the conversation with obvious intelligence. "He could have killed you a dozen times during the repairs," Qualvier said simply. "In those radiation fields, with his enhanced strength and your vulnerability, elimination would have been efficient. Instead, he protected you. That is not the behavior of a mindless predator." Bolt tilted his head, processing the conversation, then looked up at Qualvier. "You afraid? Before?" he asked, his pronunciation careful but clear. "Yes," Qualvier admitted. "My people have been hurt by your kind." "Understand," Bolt replied. "Not hurt. Friends. Protect. Friends." The simple sincerity in the cub's voice seemed to affect everyone in the room. Here was a being that the galaxy feared above all others, offering friendship and protection with the innocent directness of a child. "The hearing won't be easy," Commander Vulneth warned. "The Council will want proof that Bolt can be controlled, that he won't become a threat as he matures. They'll want guarantees that no human can give." "Then we'll give them something better than guarantees," Wren said, a familiar gleam in her eyes. "We'll give them science." Over the next 3 days, the station became an impromptu research facility. Wren conducted extensive studies of Bolt's cognitive development, documenting his language acquisition, problem-solving abilities, and emotional intelligence. The results were staggering. Bolt's learning curve wasn't just remarkable for a Nexarian, it was remarkable for any species. More importantly, they discovered something that changed everything they thought they knew about Nexarian biology. "He's not just learning human language," Wren explained excitedly, showing her data to Audrey. "He's developing empathic abilities. Watch this." She played a recording of one of their test sessions, where various crew members had interacted with Bolt while experiencing different emotional states. In every case, the cub had responded appropriately, offering comfort to those who were sad, sharing excitement with those who were happy, showing concern for those who were anxious. "Nexarians aren't emotionless killing machines," Wren continued. "They're empaths. That's why they became isolated apex predators. Without their bonded partners to help them process emotions, they became overwhelmed and withdrew from contact with other species." "You're saying they need us as much as we need them?" Audrey asked. "I'm saying they've been going insane from loneliness for thousands of years," Wren replied. "And Bolt is proof that the partnership can be restored." The transport to Capital Station was surreal. Audrey found herself in a luxury cabin aboard a coalition diplomatic vessel, with Bolt curled up on what was probably the most expensive furniture he'd ever destroyed with his claws. The crew treated them with a mixture of fascination and terror. Word of the human and her Nexarian had spread throughout the galaxy. "Nervous?" Audrey asked Bolt as they approached the massive orbital station that served as the Coalition's seat of government. "Excited," Bolt replied, pressing his nose against the viewport to watch the approaching station. His vocabulary now included abstract concepts like excitement, curiosity, and hope. Meet new people. The hearing chamber was intimidating. A vast amphitheater filled with representatives from hundreds of species, all there to witness what many considered the most important interspecies contact event in galactic history. Audrey and Bolt stood in the center, surrounded by a force field that could theoretically contain a full-grown Nexarian. The questioning was intense. Council members demanded demonstrations of Bolt's intelligence, his emotional control, his bond with Audrey. They wanted to know how he could be contained if he became aggressive, what would happen when he reached full size, whether other humans could form similar bonds. Bolt handled it all with remarkable poise. He answered questions in his improving but still limited vocabulary, demonstrated his problem-solving abilities, and, most importantly, showed the depth of his emotional connection to not just Audrey, but to the concept of peaceful coexistence. The breakthrough moment came when Counselor Thexmara, an ancient representative of one of the galaxy's oldest species, asked a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Young Nexarian," the counselor said, her translated voice carrying the weight of centuries, "your kind has been feared for generations. If we allow this partnership to continue, what assurance do we have that you will not revert to the aggressive behaviors of your ancestors?" Bolt was quiet for a long moment, processing the question with obvious care. When he finally spoke, his words were simple but profound. fear. Makes lonely, he said, looking around the vast chamber filled with beings who had come to judge him. Lonely makes angry, not lonely. Now, have family, have friends. No, anger, only love. The chamber was silent. Then, from somewhere in the upper galleries, someone began to applaud. The sound spread, growing from a few individuals to sections to nearly the entire assembly. They weren't just applauding Bolt, they were applauding the possibility he represented. The council's decision was unanimous. Audrey and Bolt would become the galaxy's first official human Nexarian diplomatic team, tasked with exploring the possibility of restoring the ancient partnership between their species. They would travel the galaxy, demonstrating that cooperation was possible, helping other humans learn to bond with the few remaining Nexarians, and proving that the galaxy's most feared predators could become its greatest protectors. 6 months later, Audrey stood on the observation deck of their assigned ship, watching Bolt, now nearly full-sized and magnificent, play with a group of human children they were transporting to a new colony world. The children showed no fear of the massive predator who could have torn them apart without effort. To them, he was just Bolt, who told funny stories in his careful, measured speech and gave the best hugs in the galaxy. "The Empire still whispers about it, you know," Wren said, joining her at the viewport. "The day a stubborn human engineer proved that love is stronger than fear." Audrey smiled, watching Bolt carefully help a small girl reach a toy she'd dropped, his massive claws delicate as surgeon's tools. "We didn't prove anything," she said. "We just remembered something the galaxy forgot. That family isn't about species or biology. It's about choosing to care for each other." In the cargo bay below, Bolt looked up and caught sight of Audrey through the viewport. His amber eyes brightened, and he made the happy, chirping sound that always meant, "Everything is right in my world." And for the first time in millennia, the galaxy was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything could be right in theirs too.